Right, hello. I'm live and going to talk about autism awareness today. So, it's Autism Awareness Week, as you probably know, and I thought it'd be good to do an Ask Me Anything here on my Dan Jones Hypnosis YouTube channel. I've got a few questions in advance that people have wanted answered, so I'll answer them. And over in the little comments bit, feel free to ask any other questions that you may have. I have got about 20 years of experience working with people with autism and with their families, and I've done it from working with in residential settings all the way through to working doing family therapy type work and working closely with schools and lots of other professionals. And as well as having that professional experience, I'm autistic. So I've obviously got my personal experiences as well that I can share. So hopefully whoever comes on can hear me fine. I'm trying to see, this is my first proper live video here on YouTube. So I'm just trying to see whether I can be heard. It kind of looks like the little speakery thing is showing that I can. So one question that I was asked was around someone who was diagnosed quite late. So they're about 17 when they were diagnosed. And the doctor had, in my opinion, stupidly said that it was too late to do anything to help this 17-year-old lad, which is complete rubbish. Obviously, people can be helped at any age. I wasn't diagnosed until 30, whatever it was, a few years ago. And because of my background and because of things that I've done through my life, like getting into doing therapy and stuff, I feel that I've been helped. And so there's lots of stuff that, had someone taught me this stuff when I was a teenager or a young adult, it would have been really, really helpful. So no doctor should say, sorry, too late to help your child. That's just not really something you should say to a parent. So what the parent wanted to know was how she could help her son. And obviously there's lots of different things you can do. I've got nowhere to put my pad down, which has the questions on. So that's why I keep looking away. There are lots of different things that you can do. You can, she'd mentioned about him lacking confidence, and you can help someone with their confidence. You can help them you can use mental rehearsal. Obviously, the way that you encourage people. So there are two ways parents, when you're doing encouraging behavior, parents encourage people. One is praising when people succeed at things. The other is praising when people have tried their best at something. And the best way is to obviously be encouraging when people try their best, rather than encouraging just when someone has succeeded. So saying, wow, that's brilliant, that's excellent, you've won, or whatever it is. What that can do is it can set the child up to fail, because if a child ends up, or anyone ends up thinking that they're not going to achieve success, obviously this is more prevalent when someone's a child, because they're developing their ability of having confidence and things like that. If you only praise when people achieve success or achieve a certain grade or whatever it happens to be, then what happens is if they feel like they might not hit that grade, then it increases the chances that they won't even try, because they'll expect, well, I might fail, and failure can hurt so much that it's better not to try, because if you don't try, you don't fail. Whereas if you're constantly praising, that it doesn't mean you don't say, wow, that's incredible, you won, or whatever it happens to be, or you got a C grade or whatever, B grade, A grade. But what it means is that you praise when they've done their best, when you know they've done their best. Even if they fail at something and totally lose at something, it doesn't matter. If you've done the best you can do, nobody's perfect the second they start doing something. I love playing pool, and when I first started playing pool, obviously I was rubbish at it. If someone just said, oh, well, you lost again, then I'd get very demotivated. And I don't know how many others with autism think the same as me, but I struggle to do things around people if I think that I'm going to fail. So I don't mind failing at things, but I don't like to fail in front of others at things, because then you have to figure out how to deal with their response to you. And that's really confusing. I find it really confusing to know what to do in that kind of situation. So I'd rather get sort of proficient-ish at something before someone publicly sees me give it a go, whatever it happens to be. Most recently, for example, like playing my drum. And so if you're someone with that kind of mindset, then someone constantly just praising you when you succeed is going to set you up to fail, because they're praising you only at that end point, only at the destination. And what you want is, wow, that's incredible, you're doing really well, you're progressing well, and having people point out your journey. And that obviously is what helps to build confidence. There are a few other things that I've done for myself. A few other tricks are using mental rehearsal, and doing mental rehearsal in a very specific way. So you kind of see yourself through the eyes of somebody that you know believes in you and likes you. So obviously you need those people in your life to be able to see that and think, oh yeah, I know my mum or my dad, they really like me. So you see yourself from their perspective, and you do that in your mind, and you think, what are they seeing? So this is something a parent or a therapist or whoever can do with somebody, just talking them through, what do you think that person's seeing in that you there? So it's not the you here we're talking about, it's the that you there. What are they seeing? What's that confident person? What's the behavior? And it could be like shoulders back, chest out, all these sort of signs. So you get someone to mentally rehearse that and start to see themselves as that confident person, and then they can try it on. So they can, in their mind, just imagine stepping into it. And there's obviously lots of variations of that for building confidence. Like, you can imagine a circle on the floor and imagine yourself stood in that circle, and then you take a step forward into that confident you in that circle, and you take on that confidence. But obviously, ultimately, confidence only comes from learning and from getting better at something. And hi to someone who's already commented. So confidence comes from learning and getting better at something. And for example, I wouldn't be confident driving. I can't drive. I think I'd be a terrible driver, because I can't understand how drivers can do what they do without losing their temper. But me being a confident driver would be a mistake. So anything to be true confidence, you've got to actually go out there and do something and start learning. So obviously it doesn't help if, say, a doctor, for example, comes along and says, there's nothing you can do to help your child. And so things you can do for helping someone with confidence are obviously just build up that confidence and start letting them know they're doing things right, and letting them know that you're proud of each small step that they take. It doesn't matter how small the step is. And even reframing, so this comes into the question on the screen about struggling with sensory issues and fussy eating and things like that. Even with things like that, when it comes to confidence and helping to change that behavior over time, is about praising, kind of reframing even the bad bits. So praising the times when someone, for example, doesn't have a meltdown that's quite as long. So it's very common for people to focus on the meltdown starting, the meltdown taking place. It's less common for people to focus on the fact the meltdown ended at some point. And it could be that it ended with the help of a parent. It could be it ended with the child storming off and then they calm down themselves. Whatever it happens to be, the reality is somehow it ended. It wasn't a continuous 24 hours a day, 7 days a week thing. At some point, that meltdown ended. And so it's even praising those bits just help to draw the child's attention. And obviously, if you can do this from a young age, it's even better. But if someone's diagnosed later, maybe you didn't realize about this stuff and you can't start, you didn't even think to start helping or addressing it until much later. But just praising at those earlier times, praising, so they've ended their meltdown. And so you don't have to do it there and then. It's not like the second they end a meltdown, you say, great, good job, you've stopped having a meltdown. But what you can do is, like, the next day you can say how mummy's really proud of you for being able to take yourself away from that situation at the end. So it may have taken 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours before they took themselves away from a situation or before they calmed down. But just being able to get them, so you're not making a big deal of it, but you're just getting them to have that in their mind of, that bit is the bit that was important in the whole situation. That bit is the bit that was important. So in all parenting, regardless of whether someone's autistic or not autistic, they always say to focus on the positives and not focus so much on the negatives. That doesn't mean letting people get away with negatives, because obviously if you do behavior, there's got to be consequences if that behavior is not desired behavior. But what you don't want is to focus so heavily on that you end up missing the successes and helping them to realize their own successes, like realize when they had a tantrum or got angry about something and managed to calm down, or when they're in a situation having sensory overload and made you aware that they're suffering sensory overload. So just being able to thank a child, obviously in a child friendly way, depending on their age, thanking them for letting you know that they were struggling is a good sign. Obviously what you want is to thank them for letting you know when they're saying something like, I want to leave the shop now, whatever, something that isn't throwing things off the shelves. You want to let them know then that that's the bit that you respect. You don't want them to do the throwing things off the shelves, but you do want them to let you know, I'm struggling, so please get me out of this situation. And that's what, when they get older and when they become a young adult and then become an older adult and have to try and survive in work or whatever their future context is, they're going to need these little skills to try and make that happen. So let's just look on the screen. So fussy eating, yeah, I can understand how that would be really hard to take someone out if they're a fussy eater. Part of eating is, I'll tell you my experience of me eating so that you can understand. Obviously, every autistic person is different. I have a really weird relationship with food, I think, or others seem to think, is that I don't particularly like eating. I find eating a chore. I find most things quite bland. So if I do eat something, it's got to be really strong flavors so that I can get a sense of this is actually worth it, because at least I can taste the stuff. But for me, it's the texture. Everything is about the texture. It's not about the taste of it specifically. It's not about it. I don't have any appreciation. I always tell people, if I go to anyone's house and they're cooking, just cook me any old rubbish, because I will not appreciate your food. I will not appreciate your cooking. You won't get praise from me saying, oh, that was a lovely meal or anything like that, because it won't be a lovely meal. It'll be me enduring your cooking. And it doesn't matter whether that's the best 5-star Michelin star restaurant or whatever, or going to McDonald's. Food is food, as far as I'm concerned. It comes down to the texture of it. And so one thing I think to look out for is there a texture element in terms of fussy eating? With most children, it's not about the texture so much. Obviously, if something feels like eating something disgusting, then it might be. But for most children, it's, for example, Brussels sprouts. They don't like them because of the sort of strong flavor to them, and the fact that in nature that kind of flavor is supposed to say don't eat this item. And so when you're younger, and so you don't normally acquire a taste for things like Brussels sprouts or whatever until you're a bit older. And so obviously that's natural for most children. And parents, obviously, to get around that, you can just give your child the food and eat the food as if it's perfectly normal and it's perfectly fine. And children just gradually start getting used to it. And most children will end up eating most foods. They may not necessarily have, they'll obviously have favorites and they'll have things they'd rather not eat. But that's what happens with most children. And then when they grow up, they obviously decide, unless I'm having to be polite, I'm not going to eat Brussels sprouts. But when it comes down to the texture, I think that's the bit that is probably a bit more unique to people with autism. That you have this weird kind of, it feels funny in your mouth. It feels funny the way it gets stuck on your teeth or on the roof of your mouth. Certain things like I quite like porridgey food because it kind of, it's almost like a liquid. I don't know how to describe it. It's like it just slides down, and yet there is some substance to it. So unlike a liquid, which obviously slides down, but you don't really notice it unless you overgulp and then you choke on it or something. With foods, like I like steak as well for the same reason, that once you've chewed it up a bit, it's got a certain consistency, but it slides down. It's got, I don't know, that's for me is the kind of texture that I seem to resonate with, and I don't mind. Whereas things that are dry, so everything for me has to be sloppy. I always tell my wife, all my food has to be sloppy food. I just want everything sloppy. I'll sit there and I'll eat food that isn't sloppy, and I'll have a glass of water and put the food in my mouth, put some water in my mouth so that it's now sloppy inside my mouth. If I could sort of put everything into a little blitzer thing to make everything into a soup, I'd probably, into thick soups, I'd probably do that. So it's trying to find out what are the, if it's about textures, what are the kind of textures that the child or anyone else, what is it that are the textures that they can eat and that they like, and can you repackage the food in some way, like present it in a different way that's more to their kind of textures. So for example, for me, it has to be sloppy. If it's dry food, I'm probably not going to eat it unless I'm just being polite, but then I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm probably going to be angry while I'm eating. Anyone who interrupts me, I'm just going to snap at you because I'm thinking, no, I'm getting this task done. You want me to eat this. Let me just do this task. You go away, you shut up, don't talk to me for the meal. Let me eat this. I'll engage in conversation after, and I'll just go like that, whether it's with my wife, whether it's with people out in a restaurant. It makes no difference. If I'm presented with something that isn't sloppy and doesn't have a squidgy kind of texture to it, then I think the one exception is well done roast potatoes, because if they're well done correctly, they're nice and fluffy inside, and if there's gravy, it kind of very quickly, it's got a crusty outside, but it very quickly goes sloppy in your mouth because you've got gravy on your plate and what have you. But also, I don't like mixing foods. So I would, obviously I'm an adult, so I'm going to talk about this in terms of me being an adult. I would eat the steak, I would eat the chips, I would eat, say, peas or whatever. I won't sort of mix and match things on a fork or something. I won't eat in that order. I'll always eat the chips, then the chips covered in mayonnaise, then the peas, then the steak. And it's not because the steak's my favorite bit, it's because that's how it needs to be eaten. So there'll be certain orders to how perhaps you've got to eat things. If so, that was steak, chips, and peas. If it was steak and chips and someone had something else on the plate, that would throw my pattern. Obviously, as an adult, I'm better at it than I used to be. I pretty much will eat anything. Even as a child, I used to just sit there, go into my own little world and block everyone and everything else out and just shovel food into my face and then think, right, it's done now, I can move on. In an ideal world, I want to just be able to pop a pill and never have to eat a meal. But we aren't at that sort of stage yet. Yes, it's obviously difficult if a child can't talk yet, or if part of them being autistic is not talking, whether it's selective mutism or whether it's a learning thing. That can obviously cause difficulties with understanding. I think communication is an interesting one because I flip things around. I think that I do hypnosis, and I think my resonation, my sort of why I resonated with hypnosis is partly because it's all about non-conscious communication. It's not about all that conscious stuff where people lie to each other and where people try and give mixed messages, where they say, oh yeah, that's a lovely dress, when they think, no, that's a really horrible dress. People create all this confusion consciously, whereas with unconscious or non-conscious communication, it's really clear. So animals I find much easier to understand than people, because animals don't have hidden agendas. You can see, based on the behavior you're watching, if you learn about behavior, how that animal is going to react or respond. And so when you're working with someone who isn't communicating on a sort of verbal level, then it's more about watching for non-verbal behaviors and obviously learning about what those mean. And obviously all of this takes a lot of hard work, a lot of practice, and a lot of focus and dedication to try and learn that sort of stuff. I saw here about the lots of words in mind. Something I just saw. Oh, repeating what's on TV. I repeat things that I've heard on TV, certain sayings, and for me, it's kind of a feeling thing. Certain words or phrases have a certain bounciness or a certain texture to them. And so if I hear something on a TV show, I might say one sentence or one word even over and 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 over again, almost endlessly, because it just somehow resonates in my mind. So say it was the word bubble. If I hear Rowan Atkinson say bubble, I love that sound. There's something bouncy and resonatey about it. And so I could just be walking around bubble, 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 bubble. And I'll just keep doing that one word over and over and over and over again, because there's something calming and comforting to me about that one thing. And it could be, for example, watching The Simpsons. I do this all the time with The Simpsons. My life pretty much revolves around I must be home at 6 p.m. to watch The Simpsons every night. If I miss it at 6 p.m., I must be home by 7 p.m. to watch The Simpsons on Channel 4+1 every single night. I've got all of them on, at least all the ones that are released on DVD, I've got on DVD. And yet I still have to be home to watch it every single night. It's part of my routine. I always want to get home, make sure whatever happens, I will stop everything. I will not do dinner. I won't take phone calls. I won't do anything when The Simpsons is on. I have to stop everything to watch The Simpsons. While I'm watching it, there'll be certain phrases that come out in episodes that just resonate with me and that I use a lot of the time. Like there's one episode that seems to have about 7 or 8 different sayings in it that I just repeat over and over again. Like there's the episode with police cops, where there's a character of called Homer Simpson, and Homer's there watching with his family, watching it, and the one of the characters called Homer Simpson ends up saying that his name's Homer Simpson, and Homer Simpson's going, that man's got my name. And then is talking to Lisa saying, did you see Daddy do this? Did you see Daddy do that? And I'll just start repeating the sayings from it. Like, that's the end of that chapter. And oh, SpaghettiOs, and all these sort of things. And I just say it all the time, probably wind anyone up who spends time with me, because they have a ring to them, a bounce to them. Like Mr. Plow, that's his name. And it's a ring to it, a bounce to it. And so I just keep saying it. And obviously, if I was a child doing that, that would probably really wind up a parent. So there'd always be little bits like that I would always repeat. But I also not just repeat TV programs, but I'd repeat things like if I saw certain words on road signs, if the word kind of resonated in some way, I would just say that road sign, and I would just start shouting things out. And I do the same now. I'll be walking through a street and I'll just say words that I see that resonate with me. And there's no context, no reason for me to say that word. My wife, if she's walking with me, she doesn't need to know that I've just seen a road sign for Bognor or something. But I'll say it. And conversation, unless it's about hypnosis or about something that I'm choosing to talk about, I will probably not say anything to you. I'll probably glare at you until you shut up and go away, and think, if I don't add to the conversation, if I don't acknowledge you, you'll go away, and then I can just get back into my head and do my own thing again. And obviously in some contexts I attempt not to appear rude, so I'm not doing it intentionally to be rude, but I'll attempt not to appear rude, like if I'm out with my wife at a work do of hers or something. So even as an adult, I do some of these bits and pieces, although other bits I can control more. My wife says it's a bit like Sheldon with his knock, 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 penny, knock, 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 penny, knock, 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 penny. And then obviously if he's interrupted, like goes knock, 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 and then she opens the door, he has that pattern still needing to be completed. So even as an adult, someone who's nearly 40, I still get that kind of, my pattern isn't completed yet. This is really annoying me. I've got to complete it. And it can be weeks or months. I will complete that pattern. It will be going in my mind every single day until I complete that pattern. So if I am supposed to have a certain meal one evening, and then something happens, like maybe I was going to have to go to the supermarket to buy it, but it's pouring with rain, and so my wife and I just go home, I was supposed to have whatever that meal is. I haven't had it. So I'll obsess about having that meal until I finally have it. And so I have to complete these patterns. If I withhold myself and hold back and don't say something where perhaps I wanted to, I will still want to say it. So I'll have to at some point just blurt it out and end up saying it. And I will end up trying not to do that in the inappropriate kind of situation, like in front of somebody or something. Let's see what else I was asked. Somebody had asked about children rocking, jiggling handles, rubbing themselves or things, hitting themselves, flicking things, doing other kind of stimming activities, and whether that's similar to tics in Tourette's or OCD compulsions. And I think, I don't know about neurologically, but I suspect it probably is similar in some ways. With OCD, it's about anxiety and believing that something bad will happen if you don't do the whatever the compulsion is. I would say that with stimming, I intentionally don't have a pen to click here, but I was about to pick one up, and because I'm talking about it. With stimming, it's not so much necessarily about anxiety, thinking something bad will happen if you don't do it, but there is that element of anxiety relief, or there's that kind of attention builds and builds, or you need something to focus because everything's so overwhelming, and you've got like lots of bright lights and you've got lots of movement. And if you're, say, a child and you're in a family home or you're at school or wherever, you've got so much going on, it becomes so ridiculously overwhelming that you just want something to focus on. So for me, I would end up stroking the back of my hand or something. Or one behavior that I would probably still do if I had a watch that had a light built into it. One behavior that I would do, which I don't know really what I got out of it, but it seemed to make me feel like I was off in the universe somewhere, is I would put my watch right up to one eye, close the other eye, and press the button for the light on the watch and look into that light. And it would look like a mini solar system. It would seem like there's a little ball of sun there, and it would seem like, because everything else is dark around it, and it would seem like I'm out in space with nothing around me, and it would kind of take me away. I'd be able to focus on that ball of light, and it was more the space around the ball of light, and it would feel like I'm in space. It would feel like I'm floating and drifting. It would feel like nothing else exists. I can get so absorbed in just staring at that one thing on my watch that it would be like nothing else at all exists around me. So there'd be these different behaviors that I would do to try and escape sensory overload. That's the main one. But also there'd be behaviors to try to escape fight or flight, so anger, anxiety, and freezing. And so you might stroke as a way of trying to create some calm and something to focus on. You might click something rapidly, just going on a pen or something, as a way of focusing on that and almost getting so drawn into this clicking that's going on that everything else starts to shut down. So you stop noticing other things. So a lot of these behaviors, I would, even now, I'd punch myself when I'm getting frustrated or angry with myself. And part of it would be that it focuses your attention off of anything else and onto one place. But it does also pass to some extent if you can start learning other strategies, other ways of being, other things you can do. So if you start learning, for example, say a breathing technique as a way of relaxing and being able to focus inwards. So nowadays, for example, if I'm on the London Underground, or if I'm on a really busy train, I will go inside my head. So that's one strategy I've learned. So it means that anyone looking at me wouldn't notice I'm doing a strategy necessarily, unless you could read human behavior quite well. You'll just see me stood there very still. And what I'm doing, though, is I'm in my head, totally absorbed inside my mind, completely unaware of the world around me. And I will shut out everything around me. I'll become unresponsive to people. If I'm with my wife, for example, I'll be unresponsive to her. I'll be unresponsive to anyone else because I'm just inside my head, focusing on what's going on for me, sort of mentally, just sort of in my mind. So not focusing on worries or anything, just focused on finding a comfortable, pleasant place in my mind, doing some comfortable breathing. So I shut everything else out. So you just develop newer strategies. Now, that was one question that was asked about children growing out of a lot of the autistic symptoms. And I think it's not so much a case of growing out of necessarily. Some probably are, because we all grow out of some bits and pieces. But I think it's that you start learning ways of doing things and you start learning more refined ways. So just in the same way as any child developing normally will go through a stage where, to get attention and to try and get their own way, they have a big tantrum and they throw themselves onto the floor, say in a supermarket, and they start kicking and screaming, and they're trying to get some kind of response and trying to get their own way. And then as they grow up, assuming that they're receiving good parenting, they realize, oh, that doesn't actually work. So they might get lucky once or twice, but generally it doesn't work. Mum or dad don't give me what I want when I start rolling around on the floor, kicking and screaming. And so they start learning new ways, more nuanced ways of doing things and of responding. So suddenly they perhaps start to learn to emotionally blackmail you rather than kicking and screaming and hoping somehow that gets a result, which is kind of what they've been doing since birth, just because when they couldn't really talk, a baby would cry to get, you don't know what the cry means necessarily, and the baby would just cry as a way of saying something is wrong, do something about it. And then obviously the different cries, the baby does cry differently for different things, but that starts developing more and more as the baby starts growing up. And then as a toddler, they now have full-on tantrums rather than just crying. And it's not so much about their basic needs like food, water, and needing the toilet and feeling somehow uncomfortable. It's now about, perhaps I want that chocolate bar, or I want that toy, or whatever it happens to be. So they're now actively trying to use a strategy. Obviously, at their age, they're not thinking about it like that. So we all grow and evolve. And so I think that's what often happens, is that some of this stuff, you learn new ways of doing things and you get feedback from people. So if people are telling you something's wrong by the way they feedback, if you can start getting some reflective kind of perspective on things, which perhaps an autistic child who's got a lower IQ or who struggles with learning, they won't be able to do this so easily. An autistic child who's perhaps got a slightly higher IQ or an average IQ who can learn, they'll do this much easier. They can realize, oh, when I grabbed that person's clothing because I thought, oh, that's nice and soft, I want to touch that, and they whacked me for doing that, and then that happened again and again and again, that means don't do it. And so perhaps you still like touching soft things and you still feel a compulsion to touch soft things, but you put your hands in your pockets, or you find a strategy that works for you. And some people don't find a strategy that works for them, and they might need help. They might need someone to say, oh, what do you think is behind them hitting you whenever you touch their clothing? and they might think, well, I don't know what's behind it, because they don't have that insight. And so it's again about having someone that can help them find that insight. The whole weird noises thing, I have been told off in business meetings and all sorts of places for randomly making weird noises, and I'm a nearly 40-year-old adult, and I won't notice I'm doing it. I mimic a lot of things. So I mimic people saying their name. If somehow, again, it comes down to somehow it has a certain ring to it or bounce to it that sounds like, I don't know, it just seems to flow or resonate with me. So I'll mimic those names. I'll mimic certain phrases people say or certain accents people have. And obviously people can take offense to that when suddenly you're mimicking their accent and you didn't mean to. You don't even consciously realize you're doing it. And suddenly someone's having a go at you about it and you don't know what they're having a go at you about. And then you're trying to think, well, what have I just done? And then they tell you, and then you think, well, I didn't know I did that. And then they don't believe that you don't know that you did it. And so now that becomes a problem, that they're saying, oh, I don't believe that you didn't know that you were mimicking me and that you were copying my accent and being offensive. And you're thinking, well, if I knew that I was doing it, I would have stopped doing it because I don't want to offend anyone. So, and copying things like if a bird or a dog or whatever animal makes a noise, I would copy that. And even though some things can be embarrassing, perhaps for a parent, my way of looking at it is just because something's embarrassing, that shouldn't be the issue. It's about what it means for that child or for that other, for the person who's doing it. And yes, you can help someone to hopefully become more mindful of the fact they're doing these things and help them to explore what's the reason for the different type. Like, for example, I've just said a few different reasons for why I do it. Some are because it has a certain ring to it or a certain bounce to it, kind of feeling to it. Other times it's an automatic kind of, I'm just following a certain pattern, or I'm just mimicking it and I don't even realize it's happening. So there's different reasons. So it's finding out what's the reasons. And some of the time you might be able to stop it. Other times it might never be able to be stopped. And I'm less bothered about it embarrassing a parent or embarrassing someone else. I'm more interested in, does something serve a purpose? If it's not causing harm, then embarrassment isn't really an issue. That's only an issue to the person who's embarrassed. If someone tries to stop me doing something and it's not causing anyone any harm, I normally just end up getting angry with them, thinking, well, it's not you that's doing it. So obviously from my autistic perspective, that's kind of my view from inside that world, is it's not causing anyone any harm. It satisfies me to be doing it. It fulfills my needs. I attempt not to do it in certain places. And yet, even as a nearly 40-year-old, I still can't help but do it in certain situations. So sites, I think the best site in my mind is probably the National Autistic Society's website for finding information and then finding other locations. I quite like using Twitter as well and seeing what crops up on Twitter and seeing what links come up there, because I find little bits and pieces all over the place. So there's some really good blogs out there, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. But most of them are, I search for like autism on Twitter, and then I find the good blogs by just clicking on things that people share under autism when you search for the hashtag autism on Twitter. And I think, so for example, if it was looking for stuff to do with young children, there'll be certain blogs where they're by autistic parents or parents of autistic children, and the children just happen to be at the right age, and so you think, oh yeah, I resonate with this person's content. But then likewise, if it's for, say, teenagers, that content won't be suitable for you in terms of what you're trying to gain out of what you're trying to learn. So just searching for things, I think, is best, and finding what seems to resonate for what it is you're after. On my website, alt-solutions.org, I try and share information there as well. And obviously here on YouTube, I try and make posts regularly, and answering questions anyone has about autism and different aspects of it, whether it's my experiences, and obviously I've written books on it as well, whether it's my experiences or my professional experiences. Let's see what else I was asked. Let's look down here as well. Yes, so one thing that I've found people have found helpful from me is because of the field that I've worked in a counselling-y type, psychotherapy type background for most of my working career to some extent or another. And as part of that, you're constantly having supervisions and you're constantly having stuff where you have to be looking at how you respond to things and what triggers your buttons and all these kind of things. So you start learning about, so that's why I do that, or that's what's behind me doing this. And the idea is that way I know if I'm in a session with somebody, am I getting annoyed because of something that they're doing that actually I shouldn't be getting annoyed about, which means that I might be affecting the therapeutic relationship and what I'm likely to be able to do as a therapist, versus am I getting annoyed because this is a legitimate reason to get annoyed and something has to be done about it. So you can start unpicking different things and think, what's their annoyance, what's my annoyance, and all this sort of stuff. And I think from doing that for years and years and years, it's helped me to gain insight into me and what makes me me. And because I've got lots of books, as you can probably see behind me here, because I do an awful lot of reading, especially around psychology, psychotherapy, hypnosis, all these kind of areas, and especially the books on things like hypnosis, they're largely about unconscious communication. And that's the world that fascinates me, the idea of unconscious communication between each other, because that's what I need to try and understand, because trying to understand people consciously is just way beyond me. People say things, I assume they've just meant it literally, and then I find out that they were trying to joke about something, or that they were trying to do something else, like they were lying for some bizarre reason. And that is just really confusing to understand when someone says something to you and they don't actually mean what they just said to you. And so the only way to know they didn't mean it is if they tell you, oh, by the way, the thing I just said, I didn't mean, or by the way, the thing I just said is a joke. And now it's kind of ruined it because they perhaps said it as a joke and they've had to just explain to you that it was a joke. So the conscious stuff really, really confuses me. And so I prefer to just respond to people's non-conscious stuff. And that's what hypnosis teaches. It teaches about body language. It teaches about, I've regularly pointed out that it was seeing a Paul McKenna documentary about hypnosis back in about 1993 that transformed my life, because hypnosis, you can't show an induction on TV, hypnotic induction on British TV. And so Paul McKenna said, we're going to watch this hypnotic induction, but the sound is going to be off so that you don't know what's going on. So, but I'll tell you what the hypnotist is looking for while he's hypnotizing this person. And that one small phrase, what the hypnotist is looking for, totally transformed. It was like a light bulb moment for me, totally transformed my perspective on things. Up until that point, I was a teenager then, up until that point, I didn't know that people had facial expressions. I didn't know that people had different behavior for different states. I didn't know that someone who's angry had one specific set of breathing pattern, one specific heart rate, one specific facial color, one specific facial expression. I didn't know that. And so all of a sudden, there's this documentary on hypnosis saying all these things that he was talking about. He was saying this means the person's becoming relaxed, the person's becoming responsive to them as a hypnotist. And so it's things like the facial muscles were smoothing out, he was talking about, and the face was going red as more oxygen rushed, more blood rushed to the face. The breathing had slowed down. The lips, the lines on the lips had spread out and so were less visible. there was a lot of stillness. And so he's describing all these things and saying, so this means this person's deeply relaxed. So I thought, oh, well, if there's a bunch of behaviors that mean someone's relaxed, maybe there's a bunch of behaviors that mean someone is anxious, or a bunch of behaviors that means someone's becoming angry, or a bunch of behaviors that means someone's sad, or a bunch of behaviors for this emotion or that emotion. And it was only from learning that one tiny bit that's never taught in schools, because it's thought that people just know it instinctively, from learning that one small bit, that set me on a whole path of, right, let's learn how to read people's emotions. Let's learn what are those behavioral signs that I can look for. So it's incredibly hard work. Even now, I'm nearly 40 and I'll be out somewhere and I'll be watching someone thinking, right, what am I seeing? What is their heart rate now? And I'll be counting their heart rate. What's their heart rate? What's their breathing pattern? What color is their face compared to what it was when I first saw them? How is that changing with time? What hand gestures are they using? I'll be going through all of this different stuff and trying to work out what is the best fit in relation to what I know about different emotions. What's the best fit for me to guess what this person's experiencing on the inside for them? So there are things that people can learn, but obviously it takes a lot of hard work to do that. And it's much easier if there's a school or somewhere in school that can teach you this stuff from being much younger, rather than having to figure it all out for yourself, and having parents being able to teach this sort of stuff and do this stuff. Yep, spoke about what similar behaviors I do. So yes, Asperger's as a term that stopped being used as a term. Now people are just diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, no longer diagnosed with having Asperger's syndrome. And so it's, I think there are positives and negatives. The advantage of the diagnosis of Asperger's was that the public kind of had an idea of what that meant. And they kind of said, right, that is Asperger's, that is autism. And they kind of put them into two separate boxes. Whereas the reality is that an autistic person has a lot of the same challenges or areas of challenges as every other autistic person. They come from the same bunch of places, but how any one person experiences that is different. So some might be mute, some might have low IQ, some might have high IQ. And so there's a whole variation, but fundamentally, everyone who's autistic will have social communication challenges. They will have certain conditions, certain issues that they share. It's just how much they share. Obviously, what their experience is varies from every single individual. I don't do therapy for kids now. I used to. I now pretty much just work online. I think doing online stuff is brilliant for autistic people. Obviously, it's a double-edged sword, because it means you don't see people, so you sort of miss out on your social skills. But the positive is you don't see people, and so you get to have a lot of time where you can just share information that you're interested in, without having to have the anxiety and the stress of trying to behave in a certain way and interact with people in certain ways. So I do a lot of sharing knowledge here on my Dan Jones Hypnosis YouTube channel. I also post stuff, blog posts over on my alt-solutions.org website, and have information about the different areas that someone with autism will struggle with, and my take on those things, hopefully stuff that's helpful to parents. For Autism Awareness Week and into Autism Awareness Month, which will be through April, I have one of my books available as a PDF download for free over on my website. My book is my Asperger's Syndrome Tips and Strategies book, which has tips and strategies for parents, carers, those on the autistic spectrum, teachers, employers, all different, and friends of those with autism. So it has a wide range of different tips and strategies that people can use. And I've got my autobiography, Look Into My Eyes, and all these books are obviously also available on Amazon and from ordering into any bookshop or whatever. Look Into My Eyes, which I just share my personal and professional experiences, but mainly focusing on my experiences as an autistic person, growing up, what I was like from naught, which is based on what my mum and dad told me, all the way through to current age, saying this is what helped, this is what didn't help, this is what could have helped, this is what I would have liked to have had happen. And I give tips and strategies about things like how to get diagnosed, the process of that, because it's very, very specific. If you just go to a GP or go to a doctor and say, I want my child, I think my child's autistic, I'd like them to have a diagnosis, and the GP just writes a letter to the child and adolescent mental health service saying this parent wants a diagnosis for their child, and that's it, CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, will probably just ignore that because there's no evidence. They get so many requests that they would just read it and think there's no evidence in this to say that the child is potentially autistic. So it's very important as a parent going in to see the doctor to say, I want you to write in the letter, this is the behaviors that I see that makes me think this. This is what the school says that makes them think this, or the health visitor or whoever, so that there's lots of evidence of what you would see if you had a video camera following someone around. Because if you don't have that, it makes it much harder to get the diagnosis. You end up having to keep going back over and over again, trying to make re-referrals, and then trying to get lots of other people to come and help you, like agencies and things. So getting it right first time round takes a lot of that pain away, given how long it can take to get a diagnosis, and what the process can be like. It is stupidly slow. In my area, it used to take about 3 or 4 years for a child. This is from when they were agreed that they would be offered a chance to have a diagnosis. It would take 3 or 4 years for them to be seen and get the diagnosis. But it could take a couple of years of the parent stumbling around trying to get GPs and other professionals to make referrals on their behalf, to even get seen in the first place. So it's a very, very slow process. Hopefully it's improved a lot now, but I think it's still like even as an adult, I got diagnosed as an adult and it took about a year, or just under a year. So it's still very slow. So the lack of support for adults who are autistic, this is something that I've been trying to talk about a lot, that when it gets to like Autism Awareness Week and all the focus on autism, it's nearly always, it's not exclusively, but it's nearly always about children with autism. And it kind of misses the fact that all the children that were autistic are now adults who are autistic. And there never seems to be so much focus on all these adults who are autistic and diagnosed, as well as all the adults who are autistic and undiagnosed. Because there's a lot of people. I'm lucky I work in an area where I'd work with lots of kids and stuff who were autistic. And so in my early days doing that kind of work, colleagues of mine, so this was in children's homes, would say, oh, you're like him, you behave like that. And I would just laugh it off. I didn't really take it seriously. I just laughed it off and think, well, yeah, I'm a bit odd like that as well. And it would just be like, I'll just go with your little joke. And then obviously in my head, I'm thinking, oh, I am. So, and with time, I was thinking, there's a very good chance that I might be autistic. And I was facing discrimination in work and all these sort of things for being different and not understanding things correctly and all these kind of things that you get. And so I was always finding it really difficult to hold down jobs. The thing that motivated me to hold down jobs was by being in a relationship and knowing that I had to keep the job for the benefit of the person I'm in a relationship with, because or else we lose the place we live in. And so I've got to keep an income coming in. So that would be my kind of thing that kept me in jobs. But prior to being in a relationship, I would walk straight out of the job. I would just think, no, had enough of this. I'm going now. So there's all these autistic adults and adults who are autistic, but have perhaps never even thought about that that's what why they're struggling or whatever. And to me, that's something that I'm quite passionate about. I want to address, because I think it's a shame that there's so many people who don't get the help, can't find, like I was talking about finding blogs by different bloggers, etc. Can't find blogs by people or information about what you do when you're an adult. So part of writing my book, my tips and strategies book, was to kind of address that there are tips like for how to get how to succeed in job interviews. There's tips for relationships. There's tips for all these sort of things for autistic people, predominantly teens upwards. So those that are getting into the world of relationships and the world of work and all that kind of stuff, because it just didn't seem to be out there. There was a lot focusing on parenting young children with autism or whatever. And so I've no idea what there is available for adults in Australia. But again, I would do the same thing. I would say search around. Twitter, I always find the best, because although you can search on Google, Twitter kind of has if people are sharing it a lot, it will probably show up higher. And you can just scroll through lots of seeing little bits of each page. It just, don't know, for me, oddly, it seems like an easier search engine for things like that. When you're trying to target specifically something like looking for information like that, or else you just get the top agencies. For example, over here in the UK, if I did a Google search, I would probably just get the first 4 or 5 entries would probably be the National Autistic Society, which there's nothing wrong with the National Autistic Society. But if I want other takes on the issue and I want to hear what do autistic adults have to say on the matter, what have they found help them, do any of them have a blog, I want to be able to easily find that, which won't be the National Autistic Society's page. So to me, that's kind of, Twitter is my go-to place for finding blogs and things. But yeah, there definitely needs to be a lot more support for adults. And I think once you get diagnosed, I know this happens at all ages, once you're diagnosed, you're essentially dropped in most cases. So you get a diagnosis and then you're on your own. And there's so little funding for anything that no one helps you. It would be good if people helped, say, adults to get into work, to succeed at job interviews. It would be good if adult autism was raised as a larger issue, so that adults perhaps watching that and thinking, oh, that sounds like me, that does, I resonate with that. They're the people that you want to reach out to, help people who perhaps are autistic and don't realize they're autistic, to at least consider seeking a diagnosis. When I went to get my diagnosis, I knew what to do. I knew exactly what to do to get seen by a psychiatrist for the assessment. And yet, despite knowing exactly what to do, I really struggled to convince the doctor. Workplace discrimination. I can't do anything about it. I'd like to be able to get occupational health involved to help me, but I can't get occupational health involved because they won't get involved unless I have something like a diagnosis of autism or some other, like if I was had a diagnosis saying I was currently depressed or something. And the doctor just said, "Oh, I'll send you for counselling." I don't want to go for counselling. I don't need counselling. I need to find out if I'm autistic. And the doctor kept on fobbing me off. And then the doctor said, "Okay, I'll send off a referral." And the doctor didn't send off the referral. He said, "Don't contact us, we'll contact you." And he didn't contact me. Weeks went by. I then got in touch and said, "I haven't heard anything from the autism people yet. what's happening, and it turned out he hadn't sent off the referral, so I had to chase him a number of times. So yeah, I'd agree. The message on the screen saying autistic people are often more likely to be introverted and not seek help themselves, it is true. Going back to when I was in my 20s, I've never been particularly introverted, I wouldn't say as such. I just wouldn't be extroverted. I don't know if that makes sense. I wouldn't go out of my way to seek communicating with people. So, for example, I walked out of a job when I was 19, when I was 18. I walked out of a job that I was doing, and it didn't cross my mind to go and look at whether I can get benefits. It didn't cross my mind for anything. I literally was living in a flat, not paying any rent because I suddenly had no income, and not leaving the flat at all. So I didn't leave the flat to go and get food. I had no money to get food anyway. I didn't leave the flat to go and try and find another job. It didn't cross my mind to try and find another job because I didn't know how to go about finding it. I didn't know about the job centre at that point. I didn't know, no one had ever said to me, oh, if you need a job, go to the job centre. It was my first job that I'd done. So I think that if you're an adult who's autistic, then there is that tendency that you still need the help. You need either agencies you can turn to, and you need clear contact details for that. You need to perhaps take someone into an appointment, and the criteria for the agencies can't be you must be autistic, because the whole point is that you need the help, for example, to try and get the diagnosis. So it needs to be people there that can help. If you think you're autistic, we will support you through the process of approaching a GP. We will advocate for you. We will then come with you, if you need us to your assessment, to help to make sure you're not bullied at all. Because I felt incredibly bullied. And as I say, I'm lucky. I've worked in this kind of environment. And so I know, so in advance, I knew what to expect. And despite knowing what to expect, I felt very, very bullied by the doctor. I felt very bullied by that early part of the process. The psychiatrist that assessed me was brilliant. Literally, I sat down with my mum, who had to come in with me nearly straight away. The psychiatrist said, you're definitely autistic, but we've got to go through the whole assessment anyway. And being someone who's into psychology and stuff like that, I thought, how on earth have you figured that out? I've literally sat down. How can you know that? I've just sat down with my mum, and she's just said, oh, I don't think my son's autistic, and done all her piece. And now you're telling me I'm definitely autistic. So, the psychiatrist was brilliant and very helpful, and that bit went fine. But it was getting to that point that was the challenge. And I think there are lots of people who are perhaps much older now who struggle, and obviously autism often runs in families. So if someone older, say a grandparent, is autistic, then there's a good chance that others in the family might end up being autistic as well. But I do think there needs to be more help out there. I obviously am not going to go and help people, go along to sessions with people, but I try to be open about the process so that it's not a surprise to people. So hopefully people think, right, so I've got to go in there, bullet pointed list of what I need to cover, maybe take a friend in or a relative in or something. But it would be better if there was an actual professional service that supported people. So just reading, been on here an hour, but I'll just have a look at the last bit. Yeah, so a comment about employment and job interviews being a chief concern for adults with ASD. And yeah, my diagnosis also came out of workplace issues. If I wasn't facing workplace discrimination, then I probably wouldn't have sought a diagnosis. And so it is about learning. I think job interviews are actually very easy to do when you learn the structure of them. I think when they're seen as being almost like a social situation, they're very hard to do. But if you learn a structure to a job interview and you learn, right, person A is going to ask you a question, you answer them, but if there's a panel of interviewers, you answer them while you then nod your head and you look at the next person still answering but nodding your head, looking at the next person, then look at the, you work your way along, and then you finish what you're saying looking back at that first person again. And there are different strategies you can learn to be able to get through a job interview, but at the same time, you don't want to be fake. You don't want to not be you. And so they need to know who you are and how you are, because if you are something other than yourself, even if you've somehow blagged your way into a job, you're probably never going to last at it, because as soon as you and I did this when I was unemployed for 3 years, and during that time I was just trying to apply for everything, and I anything that I'd blagged my way into, I just accepted, but I couldn't stick to it. So I end up walking into a call center. I walked in, turned around, walked straight out again, and thought, I know I'm going to lose my benefits by the fact that I'm refusing to do a job. But the fact is, there is no way I can sit in that call center with all that noise, the big strip lights right above your head. You've got a person either side of you crammed right in really tight. It's just far too. I didn't even meet the boss. I just walked in, saw the environment. So they buzzed me into the building, saw the environment, turned around and walked straight out. So there are a few jobs where that kind of thing happened, like sales jobs, where I would manage to talk my way into getting offered a sales job when it's one-to-one in an interview, but then end up having to walk in and I'm going to have to serve customers now. I'm going to have to see customers every day, and every customer's a random kind of way that they talk and answer, and it's just too much for my brain to process, and so I would walk out of those jobs and refuse to do them. Luckily, I seemed to end up with a benefits advisor that thought that I was autistic, and she was really, really good and kept on helping me and saying, we just won't put this down as we'll just say it didn't work out, and we'll just put something down and it'll be fine. So I had a benefits advisor that was actually really, really good and helpful in those times, until I managed to get a job where the manager was very open with me and said, I think you're autistic. Is it okay if I treat you as if you are? I know you don't have a diagnosis or anything, but if I treat you as if you are, it might help your work environment. We can put you in. So obviously her thinking was, we can put you in an office that's suited for you and how you are. We can work, have you do tasks, how would be best suited for you. And that worked brilliantly. That was one of my best managers that I've ever had, because they accepted me for who I was and how I was and were willing to work with me. So if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, then I will go, because it's been an hour and 7 minutes of I've got a standing, you can't see this, but I've got a standing desk. I spend so much time sitting down, from writing books and making self-hypnosis MP3s and sleep stories and all these sort of things. I'll sit down and do them, and I realized I can just stand up and do them, and it's probably healthier for me. So I've been stood staring at the camera for the last hour and 8 minutes. My books are all available via my website, altsolutions.com, which I'm attempting to type now. No, .org even. My brain trying to type and write at the same time. They're also, you can order them into bookstores. You can but you can find the names of them obviously all there. You can order them on all the Amazon websites. There is my autobiography, which, as I say, I just literally have said the good and the bad. What I found, I read a lot of autism biographies when I was writing my autism biography to see what they were like, and I found that nearly all of them had a sort of woe is me kind of feel to them, that they did a lot of sharing how they find the world difficult without really revealing necessarily what it is about that, but not saying how they can be difficult to the world. And so I wanted to be able to share both and say, I can offend people completely accidentally. I can get stroppy at the drop of a hat. I can annoy people a lot, completely unintentionally. I never ever want to hurt anyone's feelings, but I can do it completely unintentionally and not know that it's happened. So I wanted to share the good and the bad and things that I never would have shared, for example, when I was a teenager. So things that I think teenagers should hear and read that they might resonate with, but that when I was actually a teenager, I never would have admitted to half the stuff that I admit to in my book. So that book, I shared everything from naught upwards, and my wife wrote a chapter as well on what it's like to be in a relationship with someone with autism, the good, the bad, how she helps, etc. And that's okay. And so and then I've got the Asperger syndrome tips and strategies book, and I've written a book on an autistic perspective of death, dying, and loss, which isn't as morbid as it perhaps sounds. The idea is that I'd lost my granddad a couple of years ago, or a year and a half or so ago. I lost my dad 2 years before that and was there supporting him at the end of his life while he died of cancer. And so that's where the death part came in, because I reacted to that in a way that others said, oh no, you're supposed to grieve a lot differently to how you're grieving. And so I wanted to share what my take on grieving is, because I think people misunderstand people because they expect you to react in a neurotypical, although I don't like that word, kind of way. So I wanted to say, look, this is what my behavior is. So the external stuff you see, this is what's going on that you see, but this is what's going on behind the face. This is what's going on for me. And I wanted to kind of share that as well, and make people aware of that kind of stuff. But also the loss part comes into things like transitions. So when a child goes from nursery school perhaps to primary school, or from primary school to secondary school to, say, college, university, going into work, all of these are transitions. You experience loss, and I don't think parents and I don't think others necessarily realize that for that individual, you've got all your patterns, all your habits, you've got a life that you just want to remain 100% as it is for the rest of your life, and it's all changed, and you've lost an entire life, and you have to suddenly fit a whole new way of being and a whole new world. And so I obviously talk in that book about those as well. So anyway, thank you everyone for popping in. I'll be doing a radio interview at about 2 p.m, a radio phone-in thing, 2 p.m. on BBC Sussex and BBC Surrey Radio tomorrow, which you can get on the internet. You can listen to it on the internet if you want, obviously phone in if you want. For joining me.